And for episode 103 of the Security Token Show, today we're going to be talking to you about the SEC versus the CFTC. That's the Securities and Exchange Commission versus the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission. And they actually are having a battle right now over who gets to regulate crypto assets.
There's been a lot of gray area here, right? Crypto assets, Bitcoin, and others have claimed for years that they are commodities and they don't subject themselves to securities laws. Then we have other examples of unregistered securities that have either settled with the SEC or are currently being prosecuted, like in the case of Ripple and others. And so there's been this really big divide, but certainly the crypto industry as a whole is so large that potentially both institutions need to get involved in some way.
Yes, and I don't think it's necessarily their fault either in terms of who is in charge of what. In fact, if we go all the way to the beginning where things were maybe a little clearer, we didn't even know if this was maybe under FinCEN's rules, right? Because Bitcoin and maybe even Ethereum back in the early days were looked at as cryptocurrencies. But we've got currencies, we've got securities, and we've got commodities and futures and all that other good stuff that goes along with it. So who regulates what? Well, back in 2018, Bill Hangman, who was one of the SEC commissioners at the time, had actually made a note or statement publicly saying that Bitcoin and Ethereum were in fact now, because they were so decentralized, no longer securities. However, it's worth mentioning that the SEC did go out and clarify that this was not an official statement by the SEC, even though the rest of the industry pretty much took it like a green light that they don't have to worry about anything. And from there, we saw a lot of innovation continue to arise. But it's no surprise that, as you pointed out, Kyle, since then, the SEC has been furiously going after different ICO issuers that likely thought upon it themselves that there were no securities laws that they had to follow when they went ahead and issued some of these new tokens.
And we've seen a lot of these SEC commissioners who, again, it does seem like the SEC is the most vocal and controls a significantly larger market with the public and private markets and securities. They've come out many times in the past and suggested that, as Jay Clayton would say, the former chairman, before the new one, Gary Gensler, came out and said in the future, all stocks may become tokenized. They've recognized, Hester Pierce is another commissioner who still sits on the SEC, and she has come out many times suggesting that there needs to be better framework for crypto assets to figure out how to reach decentralization. We've also seen Reg A Plus exemptions be used by issuers and been approved by issuers like Blockstacks, suggesting that in the future, if they are sufficiently decentralized, they may no longer be securities. So there is this significant gray area that Gary Gensler, who recently was appointed, he's taught blockchain courses at MIT many times, he's very fluent in the crypto industry, recently has come out with a pretty stern hand in saying that all ICOs are securities, and he suggested that most, if not all, cryptocurrencies are securities. And this is where I think the CFTC may have a problem with it, suggesting that some of them might not be.
Predecessors in the SEC have said similar statements in the past, so to your point, they may continue to be trying to claim territory here, but today, to this point, not much has changed since all of this started. We've seen multiple bills get attempted to get passed in Congress for some kind of clarity, but we haven't seen any of the major agencies come out with some kind of a framework to use or be a guide for the crypto industry. So that leaves us today where we have a case like Ripple, which is pretty much at the center of this whole gray area issue. You have one side, the SEC, clearly saying XRP is a security, and as a result, they violated 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But the argument from Ripple is that XRP is actually a crypto asset, and it is not a security, and therefore they didn't violate any securities laws, and everything is in the clear. Obviously, they would want that to be the case, naturally. If it is the case, that's going to come down to the court, simply because it is not clear as to what Ripple actually is, and there again is no clear guide for any regulator to leverage in order to understand XRP is or is not a security.
I think it also comes down to the international nature of cryptocurrency and these assets, in that it can be incredibly difficult to figure out who's coming from where which money went to which different place. As we're seeing in even just one case here of Ripple, it's been incredibly difficult to pin down exactly where the money went, because a lot of these financial transactions are just very difficult to comprehend.
And many tokens take on different features and multiple features. So it's not that one token has to fall into a single bucket. Many times it can be a utility and a security token. We've even seen it situations where a security token is an NFT. So it doesn't really matter that. It just comes down to who is responsible for regulating what. And the SEC, at least specifically Gary Gensler's comments, the SEC commissioners mentioned that not just ICOs, but previously also stable coins that are bearing yield or backed by securities, maybe stable coins. He recently called out decentralized exchanges for not having investor protections and gaps that they may soon start going after. He's even mentioned that lenders that are lending against securities and crypto asset securities need to follow securities law. So from their perspective, they're seeing sort of the whole open field as something that they might have to regulate as long as that underlying token is potentially considered a security.
And I'm certainly not speaking for anyone in the CFTC at all here, but you can imagine how someone in one of those regulatory bodies may be frustrated at the lack of actual action done by the SEC, right? There's only so many words you can say until we actually have to figure out what to do with this stuff, and it's not like Bitcoin or Ethereum came out of nowhere, right? It's been almost 5 years since the 2017 bull run, and that means that it's 6, 7, 8 years since Ethereum and much longer than that for Bitcoin, right? So a lot of this is just the inaction and the inability in the US regulatory system to actually define these things and set the rules and regulations that need to be followed, I think is where there's a lot of frustration, both potentially inside of those communities as well as in the greater blockchain world.
In fact, that's one of the arguments that Ripple is actually using against the SEC, saying that because they took so long, they clearly had no idea, and therefore they didn't violate anything until the SEC decided they wanted to go after them. Of course, a little bit to be fair for the SEC, they're just working with what they're given. They aren't able to go ahead and make up that rule book either, per se. So that brings us to where we are today in that case. We have Bill Hyman, who I mentioned earlier, who's going to be actually now subpoenaed and potentially give testimony in this case regarding his previous comments in 2018, which of course will potentially have an impact on the court. And then of course there was this idea that we mentioned earlier in our top 5 of the news today that Binance is actually showing potentially that key executives of Ripple made their sales outside of the United States, and therefore this isn't even an issue for the SEC to begin with. So a lot of different approaches being taken here. One thing is clear, the result of this case could potentially define what crypto asset securities or crypto assets, derivatives or commodities, etc. are. On the other hand, we did see on Twitter a little bit of a spout. The CFTC commissioner actually saying that crypto assets are in fact under the purview of the CFTC. So that brings us back to nothing. We are still in a complete gray area. We have no idea what the actual clarifications are. We do know that there's the Howey test and securities law that must be followed. And for now, that's what we recommend everybody in the United States and in this space follows.
And it's just crazy, right? I mean, the Howey test is fantastic. It's been used, and it's the de facto rule book here for securities, but this is something that came about in the 30s, right? Like, this is kind of ridiculous that we're using rules from 80, 90 years ago to define our investment products today. Clearly the landscape has changed tremendously, and I think, as you said, the implications of this case will cause and force regulators to define these things, both from a security versus not securities perspective. We've got tax implications that could come from this kind of thing. A lot of different pieces here that need to be unpacked. It's an ongoing saga. Certainly not going to end anytime soon, but hopefully this was a good primer to bring you up to speed on what's been going on in this entire world of U.S. regulation when it comes to crypto assets.
And keep an eye on all these regulations and the legislators as well, because there are active bills getting passed, some that might seem more favorable than others for the crypto industry, so be sure to call your senators who are responsible for promoting and sponsoring those bills to Congress. But meanwhile, all we can do is keep you informed. So hopefully you learned something. If you have any questions, you can reach out to Kyle or myself directly on LinkedIn or Twitter, or you can find us at stomarket.com, where you can get all the latest security token news, all the latest security token trading information, and much, much more.
Thanks again for checking everything out. Leave a comment, like, and subscribe to the Security Token Market YouTube channel for more great content.
We'll catch you next week, and happy tokenizing.